We could call it the Cyber Warrior.
Cyber Sentinels or something like that.
I'm Cyberman. Now I'm Cyber Warrior.
Yeah, well,
I like it.
even your kids won't subscribe to that.
They'll be like,
They'll say,
Dad,
Dad, I just couldn't
that
like and
is so
subscribe to
corny.
that. You know, I have a reputation.
Oh. That sucker.
I saved it for you, honey.
Week 5, Mike. We made it.
It's the
to
longest
end.
October ever. No.
Cybersecurity Awareness Month coming to a wrap. Good stuff. I think we've had some good conversations over the last 4.5, now 5 weeks.
Yeah, we've definitely scratched the surface on a lot of good topics, and I think for this month it was really appropriate that we do this.
Yeah, I think it was a perfect month to kick this off. So hopefully we've had enough eyeballs on us that we can justify continuing this, and there's some value in it. Because you and I could sit here and talk all day long.
And we do. I hope our users like and subscribe.
Yes,
if
please
they really do like it.
Keep this train moving forward. So what are we going to talk about today?
So we're going to get off into the really, really exotic topic of data backups. And I know that probably most of our listeners just rolled their eyes. But this is a topic that has come up because of ransomware. And what we're seeing, candidly, is that there are members who have been compromised. And we've talked about the extortion aspect of if they can get a hold of your data and it's not encrypted, then they use it against you if it's got some confidential or sensitive components to it. But just the practical aspect of saying, can we recover from this outage condition without having to pay the ransom? If you don't have good backups and recent backups, that could be a very difficult question to answer.
Yeah, and it happens. We see members talking to us about a cyber incident or even just a regular data disaster, and they don't have a viable backup. I have an example. It's been several years ago. A smaller city had a server replaced by a third-party IT vendor. Set it up. Everything was up and running. They went along, did their thing, and never set up the backup solution. And they had a cyber incident that occurred about 6 months after that, and they had no viable backup. So when you're in that situation, what do? You almost have to pay the ransom at that point. You don't have a choice.
Well, I don't even know if in that point, their hands were tied,
Yeah.
right? They had to try to work with the threat actors and see if they could come up with an outcome, or do something that none of us want to consider, and that is start from scratch.
Oh, you can't even imagine what you would have to go through to do that.
I can't. Most organizations can't either.
Yeah.
So it's a very difficult position to find yourself in, and you made a great example of why we want to talk about this this week. It's not cyber related, but it is. If you don't have good backups that you test every once in a while and that you verify are good, then you're putting yourself in an extremely precarious position. It doesn't even have to be cyber related. You could have a hardware failure and not have your data available.
Yeah.
And so everybody, I think, innately knows this. It's almost like maintenance on that car.
Yeah.
But when you need it, and you can't negotiate your way out of a hardware failure.
Well, hardware failure, cyber incident, fire in the server room. I don't know if you've noticed, we live in Texas. We have hurricanes, we have tornadoes, we have all sorts of natural disasters that can damage equipment, damage your structure, damage your servers. So we're talking about recovering from those type of incidents too. So this isn't just specifically cyber related. So if we're talking about what do we do as far as data backups, what are some strategies? What are questions if I'm an executive at my city manager or executive at my organization, what are some of the questions I need to be asking of my IT staff and my personnel related to data backups?
So the first place I would start is actually a layer before that. It's a great question, and we'll get to that eventually. But what you really need to do is sit down as an organization and as the executive level and do your business continuity planning first. And business continuity planning is when you talk to your operational divisions or components or however your organization is structured, and you say, if you lose your IT access, what is the impact to your business and how long can you go without it?
Right.
And now you begin to set these very important recovery components that we need to go, and they're called the RPO and the RTO. One is the recovery point objective, which is a very specific target that says how much data are we willing to lose if we have to restore from backup. For some organizations, it could be very, very short window. You can say, listen, we can't lose a day's worth of data. And I call that a short window.
That is a short window,
Yes.
especially when we're talking about massive volumes of data.
Yes.
But you need to be thinking about how critical is that data?
Yes.
Is it mission critical?
And how hard to replicate.
Yeah.
You know, if I'm Amazon, I can't lose a day's worth of data. That's a ton of sales. And so different considerations there. But that RPO is very, very important because that will tell your IT folks how to design the solution,
Right.
the backup solution, how often we have to take snapshots of the data so that we can restore from good backups and not lose more than what your RPO allows.
Right.
The second part of that is the RTO, the recovery time objective. Okay, how long can you give me before I can bring the system back up that has that recovery point in it? And that's an additional consideration that matters because that tells your IT folks how much hardware they need to have on site, what their capabilities need to be, how many resources they need to bring, and how quickly they have to stand that system back up that has your data back on it, ready to go.
It also helps you as an executive and department heads determine if my recovery time objective is 12 hours. And from an IT standpoint, you're like, oh my gosh, 12 hours, that's fast. But let's say 24 or 48 or even 96.
Yep.
What do we need to do internally as far as a manual process alternative to accommodate us not having access to our IT systems, right? Because guess what? We have an incident, the city doesn't shut down.
Yeah.
Right? We have to continue to offer services, especially when you talk about emergency services, police and
Absolutely.
fire. We have to continue to operate. So how do we do that if we lose access to our IT systems? We have to do it manually.
Yeah,
We got to go back to the old-fashioned way, right?
And some people don't want to do that, and sometimes you can't. Some functions can be run manually on paper, right?
Yeah.
Big Chief tablet, number 2 pencil, maybe. Some you can defer the transactions for a period of time and save them up, and then when the system's restored, then you enter
Right.
everything that you had to defer. So that's really a conversation that you need to have with those business units,
Yeah.
and make sure they understand. But what you also have to understand is the cost associated with very short RTOs and
Yeah.
RPOs. And in my tenure as a CIO, I had a very, very strong leader in one of my business units, and he said, we can't go more than an hour. And I couldn't, as the IT director, I couldn't move him off of that requirement. So I had to go to the executive level and show them the costs of what it would take for me to build a disaster recovery scenario that would enable me to restore his system within an hour. And as you can imagine, there were 6 figures plus involved in that cost. And so then the executive said, okay, let's talk about how we can really live with this and what other options are available.
Yeah.
And you had to kind of talk them into a solution that was feasible from a budgetary standpoint, but would not have these huge negative consequences on the community or our constituents.
Yeah. So there's a happy medium in there, right?
trade-offs.
Yeah. And there has to be, but we don't know what that is until we have the conversation, right? And that's the issue we've got is that conversation probably isn't taking place. It's dropped on the IT staff for as far as their responsibility to create a data backup solution that meets some random figure that we don't know what that figure is. So I think that's why it's important that we have the conversation initially, and then we create our data backup strategy around those parameters,
Yes.
budgetary and functionality, and there has to be the balance. So let's talk about what some best practices or good ways to accommodate a data backup strategy. I hear, and I'm familiar with it, but some of our listeners may not be, about a 3-2-1 strategy. Can you kind of explain what that is?
Yeah, so now we're into the backups themselves.
Yeah.
How are we going to do the backups and what is involved in that? So once you've done your business continuity planning and now you've decided, okay, we're going to come up with a backup strategy to support those objectives, then your IT folks sit down and they look at the sets of data that they've got to back up, and ideally they would have 3 copies. That's the 3 and the 3-2-1. 1 copy locally, so if a hardware failure occurred, say a server went down and you have a warm standby or you have another target server you can stand up quickly, you restore to that quickly, and that's a very IT-centric function, and you just try to get it done within the RTO using the backups that support the RPO.
Right.
I'll try not to use those acronyms all the time. But if you have a different type of incident, say a cyber attack or a physical site attack issue like a fire or a flood or some kind of condition that makes your primary data site unusable, now you've got to go to a secondary location. Well, if you had the backups at the primary location only, they may have been compromised. So you at least need a second copy that is off-site and that you can get to restore in the case of if something happened to your primary location. That's the number 2 in there. And then ideally you would have a third copy that is somewhere in the cloud that you can obtain, you can get to, that is what we call immutable. It's stored in a type of storage that is not changeable.
Right.
So that if you suffer a cyber event, such as a ransomware attack, and the threat actors are able to gain access to your servers and your data center environment, they cannot encrypt your backups.
Right.
That's how they're extorting money in the double extortion, right? They're encrypting your backups, they're making them unusual, because they know you're not going to pay the ransom if you can restore yourself.
Right. They've learned and adapted.
Yes, this is a money proposition for them, and they've learned when they didn't get paid, what things prevented them from getting paid, and then how could they address that so that they could increase their likelihood of getting paid.
So they've adapted. So now it's our turn to adapt, right, to the threat. And I think it's very, very important to note. You said it in there, but I want to hammer the fact home that having your data backup sitting right next door to your production data or the data your data using daily is not best practice, right? There needs to be a physical, geographic separation, whether that's across town, a separate building, hundreds of miles geographically separated is ideal, because tornadoes happen, hurricanes happen, those types of things. We don't want your 3 and your 2 and in your data backup strategy to both go away all at once, and you're only left with one.
Yeah, in the old days, we actually used to just have the tapes, the backup tapes. We would take them out and we would put them in a little tape holder right above the server.
And rotate them.
And it would say day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, and you just rotated them out, yes. We quickly found out that was a bad idea. And so then we actually, in one organization I worked for, we had a person, their job daily was to go around and pick up the tape from location A and take it to location B, pick up the tape from location B and take it to location C, and just kind of round robin them.
Yeah.
Just as a way to minimize that risk of having them co-located.
Yes.
It was a simple exercise. It didn't solve every possible disaster scenario, but it took away that one risk.
Yeah, and I'll even add another thing on top of that. You have a person that's responsible for doing that, right? That person needs to be part of your IT staff. That person needs to be security cleared, because they're carrying data, right? So we need to make sure we know who that person is, where they're taking it to, and not only is where your data stored originally, where they're storing that backup data in a secured location as well, physically secured, right? So I can't walk up as Joe Citizen off the street, open the door, and have access to your data center.
So that brings up another good point. I will confess, in the old days, it was the person doing the mail run. And I don't know if they had the security clearances, but they were able to grab the tapes and rotate them.
Right.
We learned a lot of things the hard way. In your backup strategy, if you have confidential or sensitive data that you're backing up, which most everyone does, you need to be encrypting your backups. And this is probably the most difficult level that we need people to get to, because if you are compromised in a cybersecurity attack and they get a copy or they get access to your backups, they will use the sensitive or confidential data that's contained in them to extort money from you also.
That's their leverage.
That's that double extortion that we talked about a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
So that's kind of an added complexity to start encrypting your backups, because if you encrypt them, then the backups are worthless to the threat actors.
Right. Right. So disaster recovery. We talk about disaster recovery, right? I came from the IT software, hardware world before coming to TML about 9 years ago. And a vendor provided a service that they called disaster recovery, where they would back up your data in the cloud, offsite, which we talked about. That's a great business practice. But they would also, I call it, spin up your software, right? If you had a server failure or a cyber event or whatever, they could replicate your software that you use on a daily basis in the cloud,
Right.
using your data and get you back up and operational really quickly. So they could meet some of those RPO and RTO recovery point, recovery time objectives we talked about pretty easily. As long as you had a laptop or an internet connection, you could be back up and running pretty quickly. One thing I want to mention specifically about that is, number one, that's a great service, but we have a lot of members that come to us, and you're smiling and laughing because we've had this conversation many times, where they say, oh, I've got insurance. You know, my vendor says they're backing everything up. They're going to take care of everything. I don't need cyber insurance. So I want to make sure everybody understands the distinction between the two.
Yeah, so that's a service. I like to use, that's
Yeah.
the right label, that vendor's providing you a service. And it can be a component of your disaster recovery
Sure.
plan. Whether you're buying the software as a service or the platform of the service, and we don't want to get into that.
Right.
It'll start sounding like the Ishing conversation. But it's not your complete DR plan, and it's not insurance. They're not going to address any remediation costs, any liability costs
Right.
that come from whatever incident may have occurred. And you still need your employees to be able to get online onto a device to be able to access that restored environment that the vendor's providing. And those factors have to be considered into your DR plan as well.
Right.
Where do your employees go if the building had a fire? Where do we go? What do we do if all of the employees' computers were also locked up and encrypted with the ransomware note on it?
Yeah, which we've seen.
Yes. And that's usually what happens.
Yeah. So great service. Not saying you shouldn't consider it, right?
Yes.
But and that's a service that's not going to pay a ransom for you.
No.
So I love the fact that you said it's part of your total DR plan, your disaster recovery plan, because it is one component. And we've talked about this in other episodes. Is there's no silver bullet, right? Cybersecurity is a multi-layered defensive strategy, akin to an onion, right? It's got multiple layers. So this is just one more layer in that. And one thing I wanted to talk about when we were talking about specifically the 3-2-1 and specific things about backup that I missed, I want to ask you about, is I hear the word offline, I hear the word air gapped, and you and I know what those mean, but let's talk about what that means to the member, and why it's important that your backups meet those criteria too.
Yeah, so as we've discussed, that the threat actors want to get a hold of your backups because they know that is your key to not paying the ransom.
Mm-hmm.
If you can restore from backup, you're not going to pay them off, and all of their work and success goes for naught. So your backup environment is a target for them because they need to take it away from you, put it in their back pocket so that you're more inclined to pay the ransom.
Mm-hmm.
If you do the 3-2-1 strategy, like we said, right, have a copy off-site, have a copy in the cloud that's immutable. One of those second two copies needs to be either offline or inaccessible to these threat actors. And so what you need to do is you need to either have some type of format that allows you to copy the data to it, but then that data is separate from your production environment. And
Right.
so when the threat actors are successful with a phishing attack or whatever, and they gain access to your environment through compromised credentials or whatever threat vector they took, they can't get to that backup. They can't take that away from you, and it is intact and available for your use to restore so that you don't have to pay the ransom.
Yeah. And that's what we're trying to do, is trying to avoid paying a ransom. Well, first of all, we're trying to avoid a data disaster completely, right?
Yes.
But we know that's not 100% possible. So we have to create strategies to prepare for worst case scenarios, right? We do that with disaster recovery planning from a cyber incident standpoint, from a data disaster standpoint, from a tornado standpoint, a natural disaster standpoint. We talk about all of these things. Heaven forbid you even have to mention an active shooter scenario. So all of these things as an organization, we plan for. So cyber incident and data disaster should be right there in that line of things that we are trying to prepare for, because practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, but it makes, some level of practice makes it way better than no level of practice.
That's why I'm on my soapbox on this
Yeah.
topic, right? And you've done a good job of keeping me off of that soapbox, but I'm going to get back on there now. The reason why we put this in week 5 of our important kickoff series for Cybersecurity Awareness Month is because what we're finding is that operationally, a lot of the backups that our members have are not usable.
Right.
And it's a risk that happens in backups in general. You have to be able to check and see, are the backups completing successfully? Are they accessible? Have we tested them recently? Because you don't want to find out when the cyber event has happened that your backups have been offline and nobody knew.
Yeah.
Or that your last good copy is 5 months ago
Right.
and you have to restore from that.
Like the scenario I just talked about. And you mentioned something while we were talking earlier today offline. The worst time to check your fire extinguisher to see if it works is when your kitchen's on fire.
Yes.
Right? And that's the same thing we're talking about from a cyber standpoint.
It is, and I think a lot of us, including me, through the years of IT operational experience, we've had anecdotal evidence that sometimes the backup software isn't able to get it done for whatever technical reason. There was a big database file open, or there was a hardware problem, or something changed in the network environment, and it can't access the target that it's supposed to be backing up.
Yeah.
When you're making 3 copies, that's a lot of backups going on.
It is. It's a lot of hardware.
And so I want to just put a bug in the ear of our executives, of our members, to say, when was the last time you asked your IT folks to restore a file from backup? Yeah. Right? The good news is we don't do it as often because the hardware is getting so dependable. You know, it's not like in the days when I started, when hard drives, they started making that noise and you kind of knew, oh no, this is not a good sign. I better move some data off.
Yeah.
Or it just smoke tested itself and gave you no warning, which was unfortunately the occurrence. So you need to be testing your backups, because it's one thing to say, hey, we'll go to backup and we'll restore. But we've had members that said, we went to the backups and found out they were unusable.
Yeah.
We could not restore our environment. And now you really have put yourself in a difficult position. Even if you don't pay the ransom, what are you going to do? Start from scratch?
Yeah.
Can you afford to lose all that data? Most organizations, especially municipal or government organizations, we can't do that.
No, it's difficult, and in some cases, statutorily negative consequences.
Yeah, we're supposed to keep these records.
Yeah,
yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
So good conversation, good best practices related to data backups. Have the conversation. That's the thing I would stress first and foremost. If executive hasn't had the conversation with IT, you don't know what your data backup strategy is, ask the question. And if you're not sure what question to ask, email us, cybersquad@tmlirp.org.
Yeah.
Let us give you some information to share. It's a great conversation to have. It's the worst conversation to have when you're in the middle of a data disaster, right? So we want to have this conversation early. We want to have it often. We want to plan for the worst, hope for the best, right? That's kind of the mantra, the way we approach everything. So good info. Anything else you want to add?
Well, every time I cook, it is a kitchen fire, by the way. So we check our extinguisher early and often. No, I think it's just one of those not very sexy topics that gets left off the conversation because we're busy focused on the evolving threats and the new side of what we're facing, that we forget that a lot of those old IT operational components, we have to have them. They have to be 100%, and we need to test them frequently.
Yeah, absolutely. Good stuff. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Week 5, Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We will continue this series. Please like, subscribe, send us comments, send us emails. If there's topics that you want us to go into more detail about, we're happy to do that if you'll just let us know in the comments. Thanks.
Thank you.